Because I want to talk, you wrote a piece, I guess it was, I can't remember, maybe at the beginning of the year, about, how did the end of the world become old news? I guess that was over the summer and maybe just a couple months ago. And the idea that, it's certainly, I know on this program we talk about climate change far less since November 8th of 2016 than we did prior to that, because there's a real sense of doesn't matter. Not that climate change doesn't matter, but no matter how much we talk about it, there is nothing we're going to do to move a Republican-controlled Congress and a Republican president. And now, and we should maybe touch on this briefly too, a Republican or right-wing controlled Supreme Court with Brett Kavanaugh coming on, who is, to the extent that one could put up roadblocks to anything positive happening, that, in terms of the apparatus that already exists, he is, sort of the poster child for that. But if...
Yeah, I think it's just, sorry to cut you off, but his positions on Roe have been talked about a lot, but actually he's considerably more conservative on the question of federal regulation than he is on the question of on the question of choice.
Indeed.
So
I think this is why, frankly, the right was so jazzed to have him. Roe is sort of the shiny object there for them. But I think from a business and the corporate perspective, his philosophy that government regulation is almost in and of itself illegitimate is, I think, very attractive to these corporations. But so we're twice removed here, right? It doesn't matter. We could put 5 million people on the streets tomorrow in New York, and the Republican president, the Republican Congress would just be like, yeah, whatever, enjoy your blue state. But on top of that, even if we were to move forward, we would still be, hoping that our soft power could sort of somehow influence these other countries. What do we do about that? I was rereading your piece on these disasters and looking at, I think it was New Delhi that you said would be inhabitable within, several decades because of the heat. And I'm thinking to myself, well, we made Iraq. We made Iraq inhabitable for at least several 100,000 people that we killed. And we created 4 million refugees for over the course of, 5 or 6 years. No one, it wasn't, people cared, but not that many. Not enough to really fundamentally change our government. We were directly responsible for that. Never mind, we're just, in the bleachers watching it, as New Delhi becomes inhabitable. How do we? What's the psychology behind this? What do we do?
It's a really complicated question to answer. I think personally, I return always to politics. I think that we have what I think of as a kind of a delusion in the well-off liberal West that we can make a difference with our consumption choices. That if we drive electric cars and if we fly less and if we eat less red meat, that on some level we can address the problem that way. In my mind, politics is such a moral multiplier here that's the only way that we're going to get to the kind of where we're talking about the World War II analogy, the only way we're going to get to that level of transformation is by applying political pressure to our governments and around the world. And, I think that's, one reason the midterms are so important. It's another reason that, 2020 is going to be so important. But looking at the bigger global picture is even scarier. The obstacles to change on this front in the U.S. are real, but globally, what we're seeing over the last decade is a retreat from the very kinds of institutions and sort of networks of cooperation that would be our only hope for true global action. So you have all across the world, nativist movements, nationalistic movements, right-wing leaders who are really, really focused on securing the well-being of their own country, not thinking about the globe as one community that needs to deal with this genuinely existential threat. And that's really, really alarming. It's only continuing further. I mean, the election results in Brazil earlier this week or over the weekend were, they got one more round to go, but it seems quite clear that Bolsonaro is going to win, and that's just another step forward in this. We built right after World War II, after many, many millennia of human conflict, we built a kind of a network of cooperation. The UN is a big part of that, but the EU is another feature of it. We had globalization itself, which is, obviously a kind of complicated economic system that has produced many losers. But even so, was really an effort for the world to be working together and moving towards shared interests. And over the last decade, that's really changed. It's interesting you said, we talk a lot less about climate change since November 2016. If you look at the public opinion polls, actually the peak of awareness and anxiety about climate change was in 2007 in the U.S., and that was in part, I think, because of Katrina, and in part because of the Al Gore movie and Inconvenient Truth. But that interest was leveled off completely. I mean, it was cut down by the financial crisis. People started worrying much more about the state of the world when they worried about the state of the world in those terms, in financial terms. And there's a kind of a bait and switch there too, because, we've sort of understood for about a generation or so. I've understood. I'm, essentially a neoliberal technocratic kind of person. And I had the idea that the public would only accept action on climate change if it came for free or if it was going to offer economic opportunity. And a lot of the messaging around climate adaptation is sort of focused on those notes saying oh, look at all the green jobs we're creating. We're now at a place where we see that the economic costs for not acting are going to be so much bigger than the economic costs of acting. It's almost like you don't think of making an investment in the stock market as a cost because you expect that over time that you'll be drawing money out of that investment. And it's getting to the point where it seems almost as clear about climate. There was a report a few months ago that said that if we were to successfully, aggressively act on climate, the world would save $26 trillion by just 2030. I think the number in the IPCC report is $50 trillion by that same year, and that's just 2 decades away. So,
but isn't the problem with that calculus that that's not how the world works? I mean, I'm not even talking about human psychology in that, if I spend a couple of bucks on my car now and change the oil, I won't have to deal with the engine seizing up, down the road. I'm talking about we don't, in the same way that we perceive our economy as doing well, if the GDP is hitting a certain number and the stock market is doing that's indicative of some people doing well, right? Isn't the problem we have when I talk about nationalizing, it's not because we need to marshal these forces. It's because we need to constrain the forces that are preventing us from acting, right? Because the problem is not that it's going to cost all of us too much money relative to what we would save if we do that. It's that it's going to cost some people who have
powerful people.
Yes, outsized power in our politics. It's going to cost them more.
Yeah, I mean, namely, I guess the fossil fuel businesses, but
of
in
course.
general, anybody who has sort of entrenched economic power. It's I think the sort of transformation, the revolution that the economic revolution that's really necessary is bound to upend many of those sort of power hierarchies, and the people at the top of them don't want that to happen.
Does that implicate? I mean, you self-identify as a neoliberal insofar as that you're hoping that the market is going to solve this and that the sort of market calculations. But when you see for someone like yourself who is so acutely aware of the sort of train that's barreling towards us as we're sitting on the tracks, Like, does that implicate your perspective on, sort of that broader question? Because it seems to me that, Brett Kavanaugh, just as an example, Brett Kavanaugh is on the Supreme Court because there's a lot of people out there are hoping he's going to overturn Roe v. Wade. He may or may not. They may do other things that will inhibit a woman's right to choose. But at the end of the day, the reason why, the real push behind him, the power behind him, was his perspective on limiting government's ability to regulate corporations. Like, do we, if that is the successful recipe to address, what an agenda, do we need something like that on the I guess the nominal center left? In other words, like, do we do this as a bank shot? Because obviously climate change is not motivating people enough. Do we make it about something else so that we get a regime in there that will address climate change, right? Because if the problem is entrenched power of moneyed interests, do we go for, let's just say John Doe, who is going to get rid of student debt, let's say, because ideologically that person's also going to maybe nationalize our power structure?
Well, I think that there are a lot of different paths forward, and my own perspective is that, like, we don't just need to focus on one at the expense of others. But I completely agree with you that the problem is beyond, at the moment at least, beyond the market's power to solve, and that combined with 2008, we're already seeing climate change and the financial crisis both have generated a huge amount of skepticism towards unregulated market power. I think that's very valuable on its own, but I also think it's especially useful in thinking about how we might mobilize action on climate. The question you raised about the rhetorical play to be made here. I mean, I think it's for me, it's less about finding someone who is running on student debt relief, and more about what things about climate change can we imagine and put into play that have much more emotional salience for voters than, say, sea level rise. And I actually think that there are a number of really important ones that have basically not been played by climate activists to this point. The first one is the one I mentioned earlier, which is about the economic impact. I mean, if we're really looking at a world that is 30% less rich, because has 30% less growth over the rest of the century because of climate change, that's twice as big an impact as the Great Depression, and it's permanent. That's huge. Like, that is, economic suffering beyond the scale that any of us can imagine. It's 8 times as bad as the Great Recession was, and we see how much that scrambled American politics, geopolitics. So I think that, like, putting the economic numbers in front of people much more aggressively, I think is really important, because it'll hit them in their own, they can see it hitting them in their own wallets and in the society as a whole. I mean,
but can you though? I mean, I don't mean to but that to me seems so abstract. Like the idea that down the road we're going to lose $1 trillion or $1 billion, doesn't even matter. A gazillion in economic activity. Like, is there really a way for the average American to sort of put that in their wallet, like, as opposed to something that is, like, literally affects their wallet?
It's interesting. I mean, personally, I think yes, and it connects to something we were talking about before, which is that, when I said that I'm sort of temperamentally a neoliberal, what I really meant is, like, I came of age in the 90s. I feel like in so many different ways I believe I believe in my core in ways that my brain maybe now doubts, that, like, the world is going to get better, that economic growth produces well-being and happiness, and that, like, history is moving in one direction towards more prosperity and health for all. And I think that basic intuition about the world is dramatically threatened by climate change. Right. And whether or not the average American can say, well, if this happens and this happens, my bank account will be this much smaller. If you imagine a permanent Great Recession. I think that just about everybody can really understand it's not just exactly how they and their family may bet, but the entire outlook of the country and indeed the planet will have changed away from the idea that your children will be better off than you are and will be living more abundant, prosperous lives than you did, to one in which the past actually looks sunnier than the future. And that is so dramatic a transformation of perspective. I don't think we've really started to process it, but that is the bargain that's being offered by climate change. I would say one other thing, totally separate from the economic case, is public health. There is an enormous public health interest in stopping climate change. So at the moment, 9 million people are killed every year just from the pollution that comes out of burning fossil fuels. It's called small particulate pollution. 9 million people. And some scientists recently did a study where they, in exactly the benchmarks being used by this IPCC report, looked at the difference between the world's public health at 1.5 degrees and the world's public health at 2 degrees. And they found that just based on this one public health issue, just based on the small particulate pollution that comes out of fossil fuel burning, a world that is 2 degrees warmer would have 150 million more deaths than a world that is 1.5 degrees warmer. So that's 25 holocausts. To go back to what I was saying earlier, like, we have no chance of getting to 2 degrees, right. So it's going to be considerably worse than that. But the public health imperative, I think, is actually quite strong. That's the reason that China actually has moved so aggressively on climate change over the last few years, is that they were dealing with a lot of these public health impacts quite directly.
Right, because their government's going to have to pay for it. I mean, they understand the implications of it on their government. Go ahead.
And the public, it's not just deaths. I mean, there are huge impacts just on the amount of carbon in the atmosphere on cognitive functioning. So, in cities with a lot of carbon pollution, test score results fall by 10 or 15%, which is really dramatic. I saw a study recently that the effect from car exhaust on premature birth and low birth weight in babies is so strong that in areas where they just introduced Easy Pass and therefore the cars moved more quickly through the toll and distributed less exhaust in the community, that low birth rate and premature birth fell by double digits in those neighborhoods. So there are all of these sort of public health correlates that I think people would at least be open to getting agitated about, getting activated by, in a way that they find the prospect of, say, sea level or distant cost to agricultural yields quite hard to wrap their minds around. If they know that, the average lifespan of their children is going to be cut by several years because of the amount of pollution in the atmosphere, I actually do think that is a quite strong case for cutting that pollution. And if we cut all that pollution, we will in so doing, solve climate change. Now, the problem with that is that at the moment, all of the pollution that's in the atmosphere is suppressing global temperatures by about 1 degree. So it's called aerosol pollution. All of the shit that we've put into the atmosphere over the last 150 years, it's floating up there and it's reflecting sunlight back towards the sun, which means that the planet is not as warm as it really should be if it was unpolluted. Jeez. So if we solve the public health problem, if we eliminated all of the pollution in the atmosphere, we would be saving these 9 million lives every year and having all of these other beneficial impacts on public health. But the planet would immediately get 1 degree warmer, which means that we'd already be more than 2 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial average. We'd be already past, again, this threshold that the IPCC was just saying this week is absolutely unacceptable. In some true sense, like with a true state of global warming on the planet, we're actually already north of 2 degrees. It's just that we have this weird backhanded, pollution thing that is happening to suppress global temperature so that we think we're only at 1.1 degrees. We're living as though we're only at 1.1 degrees, but the sort of true global warming impact is north of 2 degrees already.
Wow, that's encouraging. So if
Yeah.
we're successful in saving lives, we're going to end up costing lives on some level.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I gotta say, like, I'm a thousand flowers bloom type of guy in terms of ideas. I'm starting to think though that it's the implications of global warming just are too abstract for people as a political motivator. It feels like to me, but we'll see. I should have given folks like a little bit of a warning before we did this.
Well, I would just say about that. I mean, I think that the world is starting to wake up to the issue. I think that with all of the extreme weather we've seen, with the wildfires, with the heat waves, with all the hurricanes, we have another hurricane bearing down on Florida just this week, which is crazy. It could be possibly a Category 4 or Category 5 storm. We haven't even really heard about it. That the world is waking up to the effects of warming and starting to see that it is something other than just sea level rise. But the problem is that we don't have that much time.
Let me ask you this,
as I said earlier, yeah.
as a last question. To what extent, I mean, because the Republican Party, as far as I know, is the only major political party in the world that believes that global climate change is not real. I mean, as a tenet of their party. To what extent, if the Republican Party, and obviously I'm asking you to speculate wildly here, but if the United States was not inhibited from being a leader in this, Obama goes out and signs the Paris Accords, obviously completely insufficient. But if there was no political cost whatsoever to this, if the entire country was on board in the same way that maybe a small, Indonesian island was, I mean, what do you think the difference would be in the world?
I don't think it would be much. I mean, as I said before, I think the main drivers of this are, just to take China as an example. China is an authoritarian regime. They do not have any of these political considerations. And while they're moving much faster than they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago in climate, they're still moving way too slow. That is because the main... Do
you think an unencumbered United States would have been able to make it move quicker?
I think to some degree, but I think that the economic trade-offs are really the thing that is that have slowed action on this. Right. And there was a really interesting study that came out a couple weeks ago that compared the amount that climate change would cost particular countries over the coming decades with how much each of those countries was responsible for warming. And the U.S. actually came surprisingly high on the list of countries that were going to be affected economically. They had the second highest economic cost of climate change. And we are in this weird kind of karmic balance where actually just as our share of of responsibility is exactly the same as our share of the climate burden that we'll be bearing. India is by far the worst on this metric. They have their share of climate suffering is 4 times higher than their share of climate responsibility, and they're the country in the world that's going to be hit hardest by climate change. And China is in the reverse situation. China is at the moment they are 4 times more responsible for climate change than they are, going to be seeing impacts themselves. Right. So the economic incentives in China are actually running in the opposite direction that we'd want them to run. They can theoretically pollute more, and those costs will be
borne by other
mostly
people.
by other. Yeah, and that's the real problem, is that generally we haven't developed a system where we're all in this together. And so particular countries have an incentive to slow walk their own commitments, do less than they need to, because fossil fuel is cheap growth. But if we all do that, we're really fucked. I mean, and there needs to be, one body, one coalition that addresses this totally head on. I think that's really the lost opportunity from American leadership. But I don't think that we'd be much farther along right now, and I don't think that we'd be facing a different set of dilemmas than we do now. It's really, what are the Chinese going to do? What are the Indians going to do? And what are countries like Nigeria and Kenya going to do as their populations double and triple over the next couple decades?